Good evening and welcome to Chicago Tonight. I'm Paris Schutz. Brandis Friedman is on assignment. On the show tonight, Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, how some are celebrating, and the local efforts to change the federal holiday.
Redistricting, term limits, pensions.
The Dobbs decision may have put a sharp focus on the U.S. Supreme Court, but there's a lot at stake for the Illinois Supreme Court in the upcoming election. One-on-one with Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering about how her town is healing after the 4th of July parade attack.
It's just like impossible to overstate that every single year someone said something about multiple coaches.
A push for penalties after an investigation into women's professional soccer finds abuse to be rampant, including at the Chicago Red Stars.
They get booted and they never do it again. I've never booted the same person twice.
How private booting companies are pushing to legalize the practice citywide.
As I said when I ran for president, no one should be in jail just for using or possessing marijuana.
What does federal decriminalization of marijuana mean for a state like Illinois? And remembering the events of 1919 in Chicago in a new Steppenwolf production. But first, some of today's top stories. Suspected cyber attacks hit United States airports today, including both O'Hare and Midway. The attacks crashed airport websites early this morning in what appears to be a coordinated denial of service scheme. That's when a website is overwhelmed and effectively disabled by flooding it with junk requests. More than a dozen U.S. airports were reportedly targeted, and that's according to ABC News. ABC also reports a senior official familiar with the situation told them the attacks originated from within Russia. Chicago Department of Aviation says airport operations were not affected, and IT staff are working to fix the websites. A University of Chicago professor wins this year's Nobel Prize for Economics. Professor Douglas Diamond is sharing the prize with the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and Philip Dybvig of Washington University in St. Louis. The Royal Swedish Academy honored the trio for improving, quote, our understanding of the role of banks in the economy, particularly during financial crises. At a news conference this morning, Diamond was asked about getting the call from the Academy.
I was sound asleep, so my own reaction was trying to figure out where my phone was. So I heard this Swedish voice on there saying, are you Professor Doug Diamond, blah, 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 blah. I said, yes. And I did know this was the day that they announced the prize. And I thought it was probably legit, but you never know. I have some friends with good sense of humor.
As of Sunday night, just under 550 early votes had been cast in the city of Chicago for the November 8th general election. Early voting began in Chicago on Friday. According to the Chicago Board of Elections, in addition to the early votes cast, it's also received almost 2,600 vote-by-mail ballots, giving a grand total of 3,140 ballots cast so far. And coming up later in the program, a WTTW News investigation into the push for citywide private booting. But first, the controversy over Columbus Day and the fight for Indigenous Peoples Day. That's right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
Today is Columbus Day, still a controversial holiday to many. It's also Indigenous Peoples Day. Some organizations and governments are changing how they observe the holiday, if at all, while many still gather for the annual Columbus Day parade. Chicago Tonight's Joanna Hernandez has the story.
There were cheers as hundreds gathered for Chicago's 70th annual Columbus Day parade downtown.
I just love my Italian heritage, and I just want to come see this parade and see the band.
The Joint Civic Committee of Italian Americans organized the parade with more than 100 floats, bands, and marchers traveling down State Street, a celebration of Christopher Columbus's voyage to the Americas and the Italian American community.
We ask this great diversity in America to come and celebrate their culture with us. That's the legacy of Columbus. It's a nation of immigrants.
Louis Rago has been the Grand Marshal of the parade since 1972.
It's a labor of love. and I have my whole family involved. This is my grandson. My two sons are with me today, too. They're helping out.
Although Columbus Day remains a federal holiday, advocates have pushed the city, county, and state to officially replace the holiday with Indigenous Peoples Day.
This is our land. The land you're standing on today is native land that was stolen. So it's important to recognize that native people were here, and we're still here.
Down in Potawatomi Park in Rogers Park, the Indigenous Peoples Day Coalition gathers alongside local and state officials to push for the change.
When we talk about those societies that lived here for hundreds and thousands of years, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Miami, and all of the Native Americans that, unfortunately, so many of us are not taught about in our schools, it's important to talk about that history of erasure. It's to talk about that history of physical violence and systemic violence that still rears its head on this community.
Organizers say Christopher Columbus is responsible for indigenous genocide.
This is not anti-Italian, it's anti-Columbus. If it's about Italian pride, then you could have Italian American Heritage Day, and we'd gladly share that. But we cannot share the day with Columbus because of the atrocities he committed against Native people.
Still, many are opposed to replacing Columbus Day, saying the holiday is an important historical marker for Italian Americans.
It would hurt a lot of people. It would hurt, first of all, it would hurt history because the reasoning is it's just not there.
Phil Costada and his family have been coming to watch the parade for more than 15 years.
This was a time in our history that this is how things were done. We don't agree with it now in today's world. But I believe there's just as much as good that came out of that time.
Several states have stopped celebrating Columbus Day. Locally, Chicago has removed the Christopher Columbus statues from Grant and Arrigo Park. The debate over what is right and wrong still remains.
People always talk about Native Americans like they're no longer here, and they still are here.
For Chicago Tonight, I'm Joanna Hernandez.
And in 2017, the Illinois General Assembly passed a bill making the last Monday in September Indigenous Peoples Day in the state. A constitutional amendment, the potential for new governor, a lot of important races will be decided in early November. But some argue the most pivotal races will be at the bottom of your ballot. We're talking about the races that will decide who sits on the Illinois Supreme Court. And Amanda Vinicky joins us now with more. Amanda, very closely watched races here, maybe by the political observers, if not the state at large.
Yeah, Paris, there are actually two big battles for Illinois Supreme Court seats this year, and who wins them won't just decide who actually sits on the bench of the state's high court. It will also determine which party controls the court.
It is hard. These races often fly under the radar, but these are the two most important races on our ballot in November. And even though that might sound like an overstatement, it's not.
That's Trisha Rich, who is on the board of the abortion rights group Personal PAC. We'll get to her reasoning for that in just a moment. It's important to point out that advocates on both sides of the abortion issue, those on both sides of the aisle, and those who care about a variety of other issues, have also stressed the importance of these contests. And it's rare that voters get this sort of influence in one election cycle.
All right, so exactly how rare is it?
Well, Paris, there are a couple of reasons that it is rare, and one is because there aren't often actual contests.
In Illinois politics, it can be rare to have what you'd call a real contest because you have incumbents who get in there and get entrenched. And especially with judges, we have retention elections. Once they're in there, it's very hard to get them out.
As you heard, once judges win a seat on the Illinois Supreme Court, they often stay for a long time. Not lifetime appointments like on the U.S. Supreme Court, but terms last a decade, and once that decade is up, a justice doesn't run against someone else. They run on their record for retention. 2 years ago, former Justice Thomas Kilbride was the first justice to lose his bid for retention in an election fight that set spending records. You know, it's also rare because of how the districts are drawn. When there are contests, it is a given that the 3 seats covering Cook County will be held by Democrats and that Republicans will then win in southern Illinois, which is why this is a big year 2 suburban districts are in play, in districts that could be won by the nominee of either party. In the 2nd district, covering the northern Collier counties, it's former Lake County Sheriff Mark Curran against Democratic Lake County Judge Elizabeth Liz Rochford. The 3rd district, covering the southwest suburbs, pits current Supreme Court Judge Michael Burke against Appellate Justice Mary Kay O'Brien. Now, as I said, right now, Democrats hold a 4-3 majority, but if the GOP nominees win both of those contests, control of the court would flip to Republican 4-3 control for the first time in decades. Former state legislator Jim Nolan was involved with the effort to oust Kilbride. He says Democrats drew the maps to favor their party back in the 60s.
Since then, continuously, Democrats have had a majority on the Illinois Supreme Court, and they have used that majority reliably to back positions of Ed Burke and Mike Madigan on redistricting, term limits, pensions, and so it's time for a change.
A lot of Democratic power at so many branches of government, Amanda. So what does it mean for the common Illinoisan if control of the court flips?
Well, so you touched on it right there. Party control. Right now, Democrats control all of state government, including the court. And you heard also Nolan talk about some of the issues that are at stake: pensions, redistricting. The Supreme Court tackles issues regarding workers' compensation payouts. And while justices are to be nonpartisan once the elections are over, Illinois has seen justices elected as Democrats siding with trial lawyers, those elected as Republicans often siding with business interests and insurers. But the Dobbs decision overruling Roe v. Wade has also made clear judges have a big say on reproductive rights. Abortion rights activists say that Illinois is an island in protecting the right to have an abortion. They say that could change if a challenge is brought before the state's high court.
These races put all of our rights back in the Supreme Court and up for grabs. So that's reproductive rights. That's the right to go to a school or a church or a parade and not be shot. That's the right to drink clean water. All of those things land in state Supreme Courts all over this country.
And so no record spending, but we are seeing a whole lot of money from both sides going into these races. We'll get to the candidate stances tomorrow. It is complicated because they're running for judge. These candidates don't take stances on issues as do candidates for legislative offices. But abortion rights groups are backing the Democratic candidates there. And that brings something interesting up. Democrats in the legislature have passed a couple of laws limiting donations for judicial races, like one that bans money from those who live outside Illinois. The conservative-leaning Liberty Justice Center is suing to get that law tossed.
We represent a man who was a lawyer in Illinois for 63 years before he finally retired to Texas, and he has a number of former colleagues who are running for office, and he'd like to be able to support them. But this law says he literally can't support them at all. And that's totally unjustified. It's obviously an attempt to influence who does and doesn't get to participate in politics, get to have a say in our elections, and that's unconstitutional.
That case is still winding its way through the courts. Paris.
A lot of homework for voters to do, Amanda. Thanks very much. And up next, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx on marijuana pardons and more. So please stay with us. President Biden has pardoned all citizens and lawful permanent residents who have simple marijuana convictions at the federal level. The New York Times reports this will affect about 6,500 people nationwide. And according to Governor Pritzker, Illinois has already pardoned and expunged nearly 800,000 low-level convictions to this day. And joining us to talk about this and more is Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, whose office has already expunged more than 15,000 marijuana cases. State's Attorney Foxx, welcome back to Chicago Tonight. It's been a long time.
It has been. Thanks for having me in the new studio.
You bet. And so, obviously, marijuana has been legal in Illinois for 2 years. So what practical impact does this federal expungement have?
I think the federal impact is that it's sending a message across all states that we should be moving towards decriminalization. So yes, Illinois was ahead of the curve, but it is still a federal offense to possess simple marijuana cases. And so I think it is to send a message across the country that we need to move towards decriminalization and ultimately vacating convictions like we've done here in Illinois.
Right, you've vacated about 15,000 in Cook County, and there's still a couple hundred left, right? What are those cases?
Those are cases where we're looking at the weights and the amounts to be able to determine whether they fit our protocol. And I want to be clear, vacating convictions mean these are people who have had a guilty finding, and now those findings no longer exist and those records can be expunged. An expungement, what the governor has done already, has been anyone who's been even arrested, even for charges that did not lead, or even for cases that did not lead to charges, those arrests have been expunged, and that's why there's so many statewide.
And at the county level convictions, I mean, that's off their record now.
Those convictions are off their record. It is as though it has never happened. So not just a pardon, but the conviction does not exist.
What's the practical impact of that?
It's huge. Having a conviction on one's record precludes them from jobs, housing, student loans. And so the ability for one to be able to not check the box of having a previous conviction, even just for marijuana, will open so many economic opportunity doors.
Of course, the series we ran last week called Permanent Punishment did examine some of those things. The president's also recommended reclassifying marijuana from a Schedule I narcotic, which is the equivalent of heroin and other drugs, to something else. From a prosecutor standpoint, where do you think it should be reclassified? Well, you think it should be legalized.
I think it should be legalized. I think the fact of the matter is that you have it as a Schedule I to the point that we're talking about heroin or fentanyl. And we've seen, now, almost 24 states have legalized marijuana. So we know from a practical standpoint and from a medical standpoint that it is not serving the same dangers as fentanyl is. And so I think as a practical matter, what we've learned, the lessons from prohibition with alcohol, we should apply those same lessons to marijuana. I think marijuana should be legalized.
Clearly a lot of evolution on thinking on that. The president was not on board with that kind of thought years ago, and he was part of the '94 crime bill. I want to move to a different subject, the Safety Act. You are a supporter of that as a prosecutor. Governor Pritzker's acknowledged the law will be tweaked at some point. What kind of tweaks do you think it should entail?
Certainly the Safety Act was enacted to ensure that we have safe communities and that we had a bail system that kept dangerous people in jail and people who were not a danger out. And so I think some of the tweaks that we want to make sure is that the language is clear. There was a lot of misinformation about the Safety Act in the last several weeks because of some of the vagaries in the language. And so I think it's about making sure that the language is clear and unequivocal about who gets held and who doesn't, so that there's no confusion. But the act itself is a good bill.
The confusion is that there might be a range of offenses here where prosecutors cannot seek detention, thereby resulting in potentially dangerous people back on the street. So how do you react to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that happened, part of the misinformation, was that there was this notion of non-detainable offenses. And at the end of the day, a judge has the ability to detain anyone on a number of offenses. But to make sure that there's clarity around that, the lawmakers, with input from state's attorneys across the country, or across the county and across the state, I should say, my office is participating in that. We want to make it clear and unequivocal of who gets detained and who doesn't.
And so there have to be this extra step of detention hearing for many offenses. How difficult is that for prosecutors, though, to take this extra step and to really prove someone is a danger or a flight risk? Because that might be a very difficult decision for a judge to make.
We've been having detention hearings all along. We've had bail hearings, and one of the things that we've learned, talk about evolution, these were hearings that used to be held and take no more than a minute. And now we're slowing the process down, and we're using the available data from pretrial services, as well as someone's criminal history and background, as well as talking to the victims of crime to be able to tell a full picture. It will take longer. It will require us to have more prosecutors on the ground. I'm grateful for us to be working with the state's attorney's office and the public defender's office, the sheriff's department, and the county board president to make sure that we have the necessary resources to be ready on January 1st.
Again, many state's attorneys still worry that too many potentially dangerous suspects might be back on the street. You don't share those concerns at all?
I worry every day when I see someone who is charged with a violent offense be able to pay their way out. And that's the system that we have right now. I've seen people who've been charged with first-degree murder who got a $1 million bond and posted $100,000 and walked out. And so right now, under the current system that we have people who have access to cash and are dangerous out on our streets. And so I think what this allows for us to do, and I'm sure that my colleagues across the state will fully understand, is take cash out of the equation. If you are a danger to the public, there should be no dollar amount that allows you to walk out and cause harm to our community.
And I think we've seen that with alleged gang members that maybe have the resources to be bailed for very serious offenses.
Absolutely. It's part of the cost of doing business. There are a lot of these, criminal enterprises who know that being arrested and going to jail is part of the cost. And so they have access to cash. And those folks who are dangerous to our community are writing checks and walking. What the Safety Act is dedicated to doing is making sure that people who are a threat to public safety cannot pay their way out. And I think we're going to see more people who are dangerous and pose that threat held in custody than we see today.
I want to ask you about staffing levels in your office, because over the summer there was a former prosecutor that came out publicly and said that there were so many positions that were going unfilled, lots of attrition, and morale was taking a hit. Yeah. Where are you at staffing now?
I'm really proud of the people who are at the office who during these transitions, or as part of the Great Resignation we've seen across sectors, who stood by and did this work under incredibly difficult circumstances. We have just brought in a new class of attorneys, I think 50 back in August, who will be sworn in next month. And so we're trying to keep up with attrition. So we're not fully staffed. We certainly are much better than we were. We're on par with our colleagues across the country. Somewhere around 15% of our positions remain open.
All right, Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Paris.
And up next, could private car booting be coming citywide? WTTW News investigates right after this.
Our culture is vibrant, it's rich, it's fun.
We try to focus on, hey, let me help you. This is what Chicago is. This is Little Village.
Certainly nobody's idea of a good time walking out to your car to find it's been booted. In 35 wards around Chicago, business owners are allowed to hire a private booting company to patrol their lots and punish those who park illegally. Now there's a measure that would allow the practice citywide, and its backers are following a familiar playbook. WTTW News reporters Nick Blumberg and Heather Sharon have been looking into this story, and they join us now. Heather, starting with you.
So, as you mentioned, it's legal in 35 wards for if you park legally to come out and find a boot on your car, and it will cost you $170 to get it off. Now, the number of wards where that practice is legal has risen since 2017 when it was just 25. Now, there has been a concerted pushback by some progressive alderpeople that says this is unfair and should not be allowed. Now, that prompted its supporters to mobilize in a way very familiar to City Hall observers, following a path blazed with clout and cash.
That's right. The firm that does nearly all the private booting in the city brought on a longtime former alderperson to lobby his ex-colleagues and gin up support for citywide legalization. That same firm and connected people and businesses have for years been frequent donors to alderpeople and their political funds.
Michael Denegris knows he and his employees aren't exactly popular.
Because we're not a company that people love, we're not handing out ice cream.
But he says it's not fair to business owners when people park illegally in their lots, and that a boot that can be removed on the spot when the driver pays up is far more humane than towing.
You leave the violator stranded, and someone may have to pick up kids from school, or may have to get to a date or something like that, or we have some old people out in the snow.
And Denegris says it isn't fair to a business like his to only be able to operate in certain wards.
Why should I have that restriction? Tow companies, you can't turn around to a tow company and say, hey, you can't work in that ward, you can't tow anybody in that ward.
That's why Denegris is pushing for an ordinance that would legalize private booting citywide with the help of former 49th Ward alderperson turned lobbyist Joe Moore.
It's really tough to get meetings with some of these older persons because they're very busy. Plus, he knows the business. He had it in his ward.
Not only something that businesses need in order to make sure their parking lots are controlled for their paying customers, but it's also something that is honestly more consumer friendly than having these pirates go around towing cars away.
The alderperson who defeated Moore in 2019, who's looking to ban private booting in the 49th Ward, disagrees.
It's predatory, it hurts our people, and it doesn't really have an added benefit.
While some of Moore's former colleagues have criticized his pivot to lobbying after losing a 2019 re-election bid, he says he's still just talking policy like he always did.
In essence, I've been lobbying my colleagues for 30 years.
One of those former colleagues, Alderperson Ariel Reboiris of the 30th Ward, is co-sponsoring the measure to legalize private booting citywide after Moore brought the issue to his attention. He says it's about supporting business owners, not clout.
He's representing the business. Doesn't make any difference to me. You know, he's getting paid for his services. I know that.
One privilege to which Moore has been entitled, the lifetime access to city council chambers granted to former alderpeople who haven't been convicted of a crime. But an ethics overhaul passed earlier this year bans lobbying on the council floor. Moore has been a frequent presence there, but says he wasn't doing any business.
Even before this rule went into effect, I never lobbied on the floor of the city council during a city council meeting. I just thought it was bad form.
In addition to lobbying firepower, Innovative Parking, its owners and executives, and their other businesses are longtime donors to alderpeople, candidates for council, and ward political committees. Since 2003, records show they've given more than $115,000 to those funds. During the current city council term, Innovative Parking and its leaders have given more than $33,000. Lobbyist Moore has donated more than $12,000.
Supporting candidates of your choice or elected officials who you believe are doing a good job is something that has been a part and parcel of American politics since the Revolution.
I think it's kind of unethical. I have my own personal judgments, right, about whether this is the right way to use one's access or one's former status, or whether it's a great way for companies to do business. But maybe I'll just say, for Innovative Parking Solutions, it seems in line with how they do business.
A city council committee advanced the private booting proposal last month on a 12-6 vote. 8 of the 12 yes votes have gotten contributions from booting interests, Moore, or both.
My small contributions could do nothing in that department of whether you're saying convincing or anything. That is nothing. They're just, any donations that are made are for events, always for events. And those events are advantageous to me because I want to get in there and network at those events, the business owners that do come to these events.
A full city council vote on the proposal has been delayed until later this month at the earliest as backers look to gather votes. Lobbyist Moore is hopeful they can make their case, as he says he looks to do for Innovative Parking and all his other clients.
I think they hire me because of the knowledge I learned and the relationships I've built over my 30 years in public office, and I think I'm very good at what I do. So anyone who would like to reach out to me, it's joemore.org.
When we spoke with Reboiris last week, he said he thought they just barely had the votes, but he wasn't yet sure. The earliest the booting proposal could come up is at the City Council's October 26th meeting.
Surprised he didn't give out his phone number there, too. Heather Sharon, how unusual is it for aldermen to consider something that kind of goes against aldermanic prerogative? I mean, typically an alderperson, if they don't want the booting in their ward, the other alderpeople would back that decision.
That's right. This would undermine aldermanic prerogative, and many of the same alderpeople who have voted for this are typical supporters of aldermanic prerogative. Now, this proposal did not come from Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who has tried to curtail that power. Perhaps that's why it hasn't raised the hackles of alderpeople.
All right, we'll see where this goes. Nice job, Heather Sharon. Nick Blumberg, thanks very much.
Thank you.
And we're back with more right after this. Still to come on Chicago Tonight, we talk with Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering 3 months after the tragic 4th of July parade shooting. New reports of misconduct have come out since an investigation detailed widespread abuse in professional women's soccer. And remembering the events of 1919 in Chicago in a new Steppenwolf production from 2 Chicago women. But first, some more of today's top stories. 3 months after he was seriously wounded during the 4th of July mass shooting in Highland Park, 8-year-old Cooper Roberts returns to school for his first day of 3rd grade. That's according to his family. Roberts, who was paralyzed by the shooting, was among the youngest victims of the 4th of July parade attack that left 7 people dead and dozens more wounded. And as we mentioned, we'll be talking with Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering in just a minute. Outrage in Washington Park over an attack on a young girl walking home from school. Community leaders in the area are asking how it was possible for the 11-year-old girl to be sexually assaulted on a so-called safe passage route last week.
One of the issues that I have today is that that's a block and a half which safe passage workers should have been able to see her if they was out there doing what they were paid to do. So I'm calling on a federal investigation today on who was a part of safe passage, where was safe passage, and why didn't they see the young girl?
Now, Chicago police have released this sketch of a man who is wanted in connection with the attack. He's described as an African-American aged between 45 and 60 and between 5 feet 8 and 5 feet 10 inches tall. And another sure sign of the change of seasons, Buckingham Fountain in Grant Park will have its final display this evening at 11 p.m. The iconic Chicago landmark, which first opened in May of 1927, will be back for its 96th season next spring. And in the meantime, the Chicago Park District will drain the fountain and prepare it for the off-season. It's been a little more than 3 months since the tragic mass shooting in Highland Park during the 4th of July parade. 7 people were killed and 48 others were hurt. But some positive news today. An 8-year-old boy shot and paralyzed returned to school for the first time. Now, since the deadly shooting, Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering has increased her calls for a ban on assault rifles, including during testimony before Congress. And she joins us to talk about this, how her community is healing, and how the victims of this attack are being remembered. Mayor Rotering, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
So 3 months out, taking the 500-foot view, what are your reflections on the aftermath here in Highland Park and where your community's at right now?
We are still in the process of working towards a recovery. We are getting a better understanding of what forever looks like after a mass shooting, but we're also working through the memorializing, recognizing the long-term impacts of what a devastating event like this has on a community. We're strong, we're supporting each other, but we know from the Department of Justice this first year is going to be a year of a lot of firsts and a lot of tears and hopefully support for each other.
You were telling me before this taping that there's actual playbook that got sent to you on how a community deals with this. What are the things that jump out at you from what you've learned?
I would have to say one of the most important things, and this is the 198-page playbook that's sent to mayors after a mass shooting. So Nan Whaley, the mayor of Dayton, Ohio, literally called me within the hour and said, check your email, I've just sent you this handbook. And the biggest issue that it really spells out is just giving everybody room to move forward, whether it's the word recovery, healing, mourning, all of the above, because there are those who are now having the first birthday without their loved one. There are those who are having the first special holiday without their loved one, or with a change to their physicality, their own emotional space. So understanding the broad spectrum of who's been impacted, what they brought in their own lives to the event, now as they try to move forward, what are they dealing with?
And I still gather there's still going to be a lot of coming to grips with changes in people's lives. I mean, it's not just a linear improvement 3 months out. It's going to be a rocky road. But we did have some good news today. 8-year-old Cooper Roberts, he was shot, paralyzed. He returned to school today. What's his prognosis?
I don't know what his prognosis is. My understanding is this is his new normal. And it was absolutely heartbreaking to read his quote when somebody said, how was your first day back at school? And he said, if I hadn't been shot and paralyzed and in a wheelchair, it would have been a perfect day. That just catches you thinking about who you were as an 8-year-old, who you know who are 8-year-olds in your life and their first days of school. To have that kind of perspective and now look out into the future has to be pretty daunting, both for Cooper and his family.
For anybody, but especially an 8-year-old. And what are you hearing from some of the other victims and how their recovery is going?
You know, it's taking a long time. The wounds that come from these combat weapons are meant to devastate the human body. And we have seen that in the outcomes from the Highland Park shooting as well. Many people are still working on their physical recovery. Many people are still trying to understand how they're going to move forward in their lives, dealing with these wounds, having to go back into the hospital in some instances. It's a horrible thing, and these guns are made for war and shouldn't be on our streets.
And you've been testifying places like Capitol Hill about that very thing. What have those experiences been like for you?
Both encouraging and horrifying. There are those who hear us, and I think it's important when we're talking about this to recognize that this is a human rights violation, to recognize that it's not just gun violence, which everybody seems to be inured to, but we are talking about real violations of human rights, real terrorism on our city streets. Those conversations people are responding to. The folks who are trying to cover their ears and hope that this never comes to their community are not hearing what we're saying. They're fools. This is coming to anybody's community because we've seen it all across the country. And so what I'm hearing more from are mayors and community leaders who fully recognize that this devastation will land in their laps, not if, but when it comes to their community. They will now be dealing with the aftermath. It's not just the weeks and months, but the forevers, the generations that are being impacted by this
Governor
violence.
Pritzker has been supportive of a statewide assault weapons ban. He was asked at the debate on Thursday why it hasn't happened yet. Take a look.
I'm sure you understand that at this point in the legislature, you need a supermajority in order to get that done. So the working groups that are happening in the General Assembly are determining what they can get done in the veto session, which is happening in November, and what they can get done after the first of the year when there's a new session and you need a simple majority.
So you need a supermajority now. That's harder to do. The votes ostensibly are not there. In January, you will need a simple majority. There are enough Democrats, at least, to accomplish that. What do you think this package will look like ultimately?
My fondest wish is it is a full-on statewide ban. There are so many different levels where anything could be moved forward in terms of making it harder for people to get these weapons, whether it's removing the state preemption that currently exists. Highland Park banned these weapons in 2013 under a weird little legislative opportunity. That needs to be provided now to other municipalities. We know that it's constitutional based on our own lawsuit with the NRA. But let's get the ban on the records for the state. Frankly, to me, though, we're not an island. We need a federal ban.
Would it be a ban on just future purchases, or would people be grandfathered in if they already own assault rifles?
You know, in the best of worlds, it would be a ban on possession and a ban on sale and a ban on large capacity magazines, because it's both the weapons and the ability to shoot, you know, hundreds of rounds in certain circumstances that cause the devastation. We know in Highland Park, 83 rounds were shot in under a minute. And so folks who say they back the blue aren't backing the blue if they push for these weapons to be continually available to people. They pierce Kevlar vests. They pierce the helmets of the police. A policeman with a handgun cannot take out a guy who's got these types of weapons, particularly on a rooftop. So to those who say this is about our freedom, I say no. Where are our human rights freedoms? Where is our opportunity to live free from violence and fear? We as a community, we as a nation need to move forward and recognize these weapons were banned for a 10-year period. It's time to go back to that ban, and it's time to recapture what really is freedom in the United States.
There certainly is no freedom for the victims and for those that are still recovering from injuries and for their families right now. We know that gun manufacturers enjoy tremendous immunity in this country. There's a new lawsuit against Smith & Wesson going after deceptive marketing. I mean, it's a similar approach to how the city of Chicago went after vaping companies. Is this an approach that has any chance of succeeding?
I'll tell you, I think any approach that works towards removing the risk of this kind of devastation in a community is worth trying. We have to stop being afraid, stop presupposing what outcomes are going to be, and reclaim our country, reclaim our communities. We came together to celebrate freedom in Highland Park, and to have this kind of carnage come to our street and devastate this many families certainly isn't freedom.
All right. Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering, I know we'll be hearing a lot more from you on this, and we look forward to having you back.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
And our thanks to Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rotering, and we're back with more right after this. A long-anticipated report on sexual abuse has rocked the women's soccer world. The report was conducted by former acting U.S. Attorney General Sally Yates. It found a culture of sexual and verbal abuse pervasive throughout the league, including within the Chicago Red Stars franchise, where complaints against former head coach Rory Dames went unheeded for years. As a result, the Red Stars Board of Directors voted to remove owner Arnim Whistler as chairman. So where does this team and the sport go from here? And joining us are Annie Costabile, who covers the Chicago Red Stars for the Chicago Sun-Times, and Melissa Isaacson, assistant professor at Northwestern's Medill School of Journalism, where she teaches sports reporting. Welcome both of you to Chicago tonight. Annie, first remind us the big takeaways from this Sally Yates report into the National Women's Soccer League.
I mean, I think the biggest takeaway is that this was systemic. It was going on throughout the league, and these coaches were allowed to move from team to team, abusing other players. Rory stayed in Chicago. Rory's been in Chicago his entire career, but Paul Riley, you know, moved from organization to organization, and as a result was allowed to carry his abusive behavior with him. And what's shocking about that is upon his departure, the support that he received from the Portland Thorns when he left that organization. You know, he got a stamp of approval and he got to move on.
And we mentioned at the Red Stars, I mean, these complaints were going on for years. They were unheeded. Melissa Isaacson, what's your reaction to how pervasive and widespread this report found this activity was?
You know, we shouldn't be shocked, sadly, because we've read about, you know, cases like this before, not necessarily in soccer, but just in general with women. So we shouldn't be shocked, but yet, you know, we are. I mean, it's appalling, the lack of response. And let's not just say it's all men, because there was a woman in charge of the league at the time who got the letters from the women involved, who was told what happened, and chose to sort of, oh, well, maybe we could have, you know, we could meet if we're ever in the same city. And then years go by. I mean, 6 years went by, and then she said, oh, no, I didn't know anything about it. I mean, it's really scary. And then you think these are U.S. national championship players, some of them, you know, so you kind of have this feeling like, oh, that would never happen to that. Well, why not? Because when you're vulnerable and you want to play professional sports and it's your livelihood, you'll kind of not do anything, but it makes anybody afraid, right?
And that's the thing. These women were sold a dream. Mm-hmm. They were given pennies and told that they're going to turn those pennies into, you know, stacks and stacks of riches if they just work a little harder, if they just show up every day, if they keep their heads down and keep working. And what are we selling women when we tell them that you can have this dream, but you have to work in silence? You have to turn a blind eye to things.
And this report talked about grooming behavior. And by the way, these women make very modest salaries in this business. So let's talk about the Red Stars, what this report found about the Red Stars. It alleged that Arnim Whistler, the owner, ignored complaints against coach Rory Dames, including that he sexually groomed players, going all the way back to his team leading youth soccer. He runs a youth soccer organization as well. Dames allegedly called black players thugs and players from Kentucky and Ohio trailer trash. He offered to resign. Whistler had refused to accept his resignation. Tell us more about Rory Dames, how long these complaints had gone on against him, and what's happened with him.
Within the Red Stars organization, the reports against him were not that he was sexually grooming players within the Red Stars organization. That complaint goes back to, again, his youth days coaching Eclipse Soccer, and there's an Arlington Heights police report.
And this is his youth soccer organization.
Yes. But within the Red Stars organization, the reports against him was that he was verbally and emotionally abusive. Kristen Press was one of the first players, I believe, that reported Rory Dames' behavior. She reported it to the U.S. women's national team. It all went ignored. At the time, 2014, I believe, was the year. Rory offered to resign at that time, and Whistler told him no. So this behavior from him, the reports of calling black players thugs, other players from, you know, the Midwest, trailer trash, that continued after the fact. After he offered to resign, Whistler allowed him to continue mentally and verbally abusing players.
And so the current situation is Whistler is stepped back, but he's still owner of the team. He still has shares in the organization. What needs to happen with the Red Stars, you think, Melissa?
Well, I mean, he needs to you know, he can't just sell the team. I mean, there's got to be, you know, Annie's written about this, but but he's got to separate himself from the team completely. He has to be, just like Rory Dames away from the team. And the whole connection with the youth soccer needs to be cut off completely. So, it's not enough to just say, this guy's fired. You got to, and you've got to say, like in Portland, exactly why they were fired, not endorse him for another job, not have Rory Dames pop up somewhere else, not have any association with the Eclipse Club. And not send this message to young girls that this is what happens, that this is okay.
Annie Constable, we know that women's soccer has exploded in popularity. The national team has performed so well. What does this report mean for the league, for the Red Stars going forward, and parents who, might think twice about having their little girls play soccer?
To me, this report, I think, brings the public into it. We all know now what went on in this league. We all need to demand better. And obviously, I'm not affiliated with the NWSL other than reporting on it. Fans aren't necessarily affiliated other than showing up to games, but there's power in that. You know what went on, those of us that read this report. It's about holding people accountable now and filling these roles with people that can uphold what these players are working for and what these players deserve, what everybody deserves.
Well, this is one thing you just wrote about, that the leadership in this league is mostly men, and that might lead to some of the dynamic here.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's something that we can see across the board in so many industries. A lot of people in power happen to be men. That's not an accident. And when you're looking at a women's league, it doesn't mean that the coaches need to be women. Women don't need to be coached by women. But the league should reflect the players that are filling it up. And when it predominantly reflects something completely opposite, I think that's a sign that something may be off to a degree, whether that's, again, just giving women opportunity to lead or something more disturbing like what we saw go on in the NWSL.
A lot of turmoil for the league and the organization. Melissa, this kind of dovetails into a conference you're leading at Northwestern on the state of Title IX. Tell us about that.
Well, we're really excited. It's October 27th, 28th, 29th on the Northwestern Evanston campus, bringing together scholars and policymakers and coaches and athletes and journalists, all talking about where are we 50 years after Title IX was enacted. And guess what? It's not necessarily all great. In fact, a lot of things aren't. So on the brink of the midterm elections, this is a great time to look at gender equity, look at what's wrong with Title IX in terms of, the lack of compliance, the lack of women as coaches, as administrators. We're going to take a really hard look at transgender athletes in sports. We've got some great screenings. So we've got a lot of people gathered to take a really critical eye towards this. You talked about 50 years ago when I played high school basketball, everything was so optimistic, anything was possible for girls. And I think the opportunities are there certainly, but now when you hear about, some of these things, you wonder if girls are like, well, maybe do I want to do this, or what's the message that's being sent? So I think sadly it is kind of a decent segue to go from that story to this.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot to keep track of there. All right, Annie Constable and Melissa Isaacson, thank you so much for being here. And up next, remembering the events of 1919 in Chicago in a new theater production. That's in a conversation that first aired on Chicago Tonight, Black Voices. But first, we take a look at the weather.
More than a century later, events leading to the killing of 17-year-old Eugene Williams at a segregated Lake Michigan beach in the summer of 1919 and the days of tragedy and violence that followed still echo in Chicago. In a new production adapted from Eve Ewing's collection of poetry about those terrible days, the Steppenwolf for Young Adults program explores 1919's legacy. Joining us to talk about the play is playwright J. Nicole Brooks. Nikki, welcome to Chicago Tonight, Black Voices, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, of course, this book, the play, was based on Eve Ewing's book of poems about the events of 1919. Remind us what happened in 1919 in Chicago.
In 1919, there was a unlawful killing of a young man named Eugene Williams who with his friends crossed an unofficial racial barrier. So in other words, he and his friends were swimming and they drifted into what was considered the white waters. Eugene Williams was unfortunately murdered, and the person deemed responsible was George Stauber. He was stoned and eventually drowned, and that kicked off weeks and weeks of a pretty terrible race riot.
Terrible time in Chicago. So how do you turn then Eve's book of poetry into a stage production? You went from page to stage.
Very carefully.
I'm sure.
I'm a longtime fan of Eve Ewing's work. I think her work is not only beautiful, but I found her words to be visceral, and really, I found that we had a lot in common, even though I didn't consider myself to be a poet. But poetry can be very radical, and so it gives you the freedom to read the words that Eve Ewing has written, digest, and sort of push away from it and see what's left. And pretty much it's from that I was able to create the groundwork for the stage play of 1919.
What can people expect to see? Is this, a retelling of events partly? Because when taking poetry on the stage, I'm kind of curious, how's that going to work?
There is a structure to it. Even though the play is based on a book of poetry, there are characters, and the central character is a writer who is researching something else, and she comes across this information about what happened in 1919 at the lakefront. And so from there, the character delves into all of this. So it's a memory play. It's also a play that explores what if. What would have happened if Eugene Williams had not have drifted into the so-called white waters? What would have happened if Emmett Till may not have gone down south on the trip? So it explores so many things, and it comes from a diversity of voices from back then as well as today.
You've described this as a very physical play. What does that mean?
I think most of the plays that I've written include physicality. So I am deeply influenced by dance. I'm a former dancer. As an actor, clowning has also been very important in my career and my studies. So all of it goes into the story. I think it's important that we not only create images with words, but we also do something that's visual. So that's how it's in there. So there's lots of movement.
Sounds like in some ways this play is a reflection of you.
Yes, it is. And I think that reflection comes out of growing up here in Chicago. As Midwesterners, we like to think that we can run and jump and get our way through anything, and it's probably because of the snow that we deal with. But it certainly goes into this production, and I'm really excited for the world to see how this cast and ensemble does just that.
Yeah, that snow, it'll toughen us all up, won't we? We talked a lot about, 1919. In 2019, of course, a lot of Chicagoans learned about what happened for the first time on that 100-year anniversary. Do you think there's been sort of a rethinking of how those events happened here in Chicago?
I'd like to think so. I think people are willing to take a look into it. I think people hear the word or the term race riot, and frankly, everybody's exhausted. No one wants to tackle it. And for me, I made a promise to myself in my career that every year I would make a piece of art dedicated to the memory and the power behind Eugene Williams, as well as the 1919 race riot. So I've made a short film. I have written this play, and I plan to continue to do this until it gets to the point where we all know about the history of the lakefront and never take it for granted, so that something like this never, ever, ever happens again.
You've been on stage in front of a younger audience for a few days. What's been the response, the read from those younger folks? They're
so fantastic. I have to say, when I'm writing, I don't really make I don't think, oh, I'm writing this for a young audience. Oh, I'm writing this for 40-year-olds. When I write, and I want the same reaction, and that is for the audience to leave with a sense of investigation, so that they can go and do their own sort of, crawling through history. And hopefully they understand that levity and laughter is also a part of that journey. So you won't just come in and get a bunch of facts that might, make you sad. They will, but we have to embrace that sadness is a part of the power it takes to move forward, and that's what the experience of the play will hopefully leave the audience. And the young people are always honest.
I'm sure they are.
Yeah.
Yeah, out of the mouths of babes. We've got about 20 seconds left. What do you want folks to take away from this production?
I would like to have people take away from this production that we should be doing, we should be listening to young people. They always lead us. There's nothing new there. And so that's really what I want. I want people to pay more attention to young people. I want them to support live theater. And I want them to embrace the fact that Chicago has a long history, good, bad, and ugly, and it's up to us to find out exactly what happened.
And of course, 1919 will play through October 29th in Steppenwolf's Ensemble Theater. And now our thanks to J. Nicole Brooks for joining us. Back to wrap things up right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by Alexandra and John Nichols, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors.
And that's our show for this Monday night. Please join us tomorrow night live at 7. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Parrish Sutz. Thank you so much for watching. Happy Monday. Stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud of its partners named Illinois Leading Lawyers by the Law Bulletin Publishing Company of Chicago.